Every Memorial Day, Frank made the quiet drive to Hillcrest Cemetery, a faded bouquet in one hand, a folded flag in the other. His boots always sank slightly into the spring mud, but he never complained. Not to the wind, not to God, not to the memory that haunted him. He had buried his son there, a Marine who never made it past his 23rd birthday. And for 12 years, Frank hadn't missed a single visit. He didn't speak much these days, not since Linda passed 5 winters ago. The house was still filled with her voice on old tapes and the scent of the lemon soap she used to buy in bulk. Frank lived alone on the edge of town, surviving mostly on canned soup and ritual. His neighbors barely saw him, a retired firefighter with sun-leathered skin and eyes like cold iron. That Monday morning, he woke up at dawn like always, dressed in his old uniform jacket and drove without turning on the radio. The cemetery was quiet, with flags posted neatly in rows, fluttering like whispers. Frank knelt by the headstone, placed the flowers gently, and sat in silence, speaking only with his presence. He thought he was alone until he heard hooves. Slow, deliberate steps on gravel, too close to ignore. Turning around, Frank saw a horse, tall, chestnut brown, and strikingly calm, standing just behind him. No saddle, no halter, no owner in sight. Just the wind and this creature, staring at him. At first, he thought it belonged to someone nearby, maybe a kid from the farms who'd lost control. But the horse didn't look lost. It looked intentional, like it had been drawn there. It didn't move, didn't graze, didn't spook. It just stood like a sentinel in mourning. Frank stood slowly, unsure what to do. He reached out a tentative hand, expecting the animal to flinch, but it didn't. Instead, the horse stepped forward, lowering its head to the grave. Then it exhaled. A long, trembling breath that somehow sounded respectful. Frank's throat tightened. He stayed another hour, unable to pull himself away. The horse stayed too. When he finally turned to leave, the animal followed. Down the hill, through the gate, back to the truck. And when he opened the driver's side door, the horse simply stopped and stood there like it was waiting. He looked around for someone, anyone, but the cemetery was empty. "Go on now," he said softly, waving a hand. But the horse didn't move. It blinked slowly, then nudged the truck's mirror. That small gesture nearly buckled Frank's knees. He felt something stirring, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Back home, he figured that was the end of it. Maybe the horse had wandered off. Maybe it was a strange moment, one he'd remember but not question too deeply. But the next morning, when he stepped out with his coffee, the horse was there, standing by the fence like it had always lived there. Frank froze. Something about those eyes, steady, mournful, and wise beyond reason, pulled at him. He hadn't planned to speak, but the words came out anyway, raw and broken. "You look like you lost someone too." And the horse, once again, didn't move. Frank didn't sleep well that night. He kept seeing the horse's eyes in the dark, like two quiet lanterns glowing in the fog of his mind. By morning, the animal was still there, standing by the tree line like a sentinel. Something about its stillness made the silence in his house feel less empty and more alive. He called animal control, hesitated, then hung up before anyone picked up. He wasn't ready to let go, and something deep inside told him this wasn't just a stray. The horse wasn't panicked, wasn't hungry, wasn't pacing. It was waiting, like it had chosen him for a reason. When he finally approached with a bucket of water and an old apple, the horse walked forward with a calm dignity. Its coat was dusty but smooth, and its ribs showed only slightly. There was a scar near its right flank, long, thin, and healed, but clearly from something violent. Frank couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. That this horse wasn't just lost, it was grieving. It didn't take food immediately. Instead, it stood close, breathing softly against his jacket, like it recognized the weight he carried, like it was drawn to it. The neighbors started whispering. A few cars slowed when they saw Frank walking the horse near the road. One woman called the sheriff, who came by and asked questions Frank couldn't answer. No brand, no microchip, no report of a missing animal. Just a mystery in his yard. Could be someone's therapy horse, the deputy suggested, or a runaway from a trailer accident. But Frank didn't believe it. This horse hadn't run from something. It had come to something. To him. That idea scared him more than he expected. The deputy warned him, "You keep it. It's on you. Vet bills. Feed. Responsibility." Frank just nodded, the way he used to during fire briefings, taking it all in with a blank face. Inside, though, something had already shifted. He couldn't let the horse go. Not now. That night, he dug out old tools from the shed, wood, rope, tarps, and started building a makeshift shelter. His hands, arthritic and stubborn, moved with purpose for the first time in years. He worked until his shoulders ached and the sky turned to ink. The horse didn't leave. It stood nearby, watching. Occasionally it'd walk closer, snort gently, then return to its spot. There was no fear in it, just presence. Frank found himself talking aloud as he worked, telling stories he hadn't told in a decade, about the firehouse, about Linda, about his son. By dawn, the shelter was rough but sturdy, and Frank, sitting on an old milk crate, whispered, "I guess you're home now." It wasn't a decision made with logic. It was made with grief, with memory, with something older than words. He couldn't walk away anymore. Frank took the horse to the local vet 2 towns over, a gruff woman named Dr. Maddox who didn't waste words. "He's dehydrated, underweight, but he's strong," she said, examining the scar with careful fingers. "Been through something, but whatever it was, he made it out." Frank nodded, unable to look away from the horse's eyes. He asked if horses could grieve. Dr. Maddox paused, then said, "More than we think. They remember. They wait. Some never stop looking for what they lost." That answer hit Frank hard, because he knew exactly what that felt like, waking up each day expecting someone who never comes back. Back at home, he gave the horse a name, Sergeant, not because of his son's rank, but because of the way the animal held himself, with quiet strength and watchful honor. Frank began waking earlier, feeding Sergeant, brushing him down, even repairing the old fence that had sagged for years. The neighbors started noticing. One brought over a bale of hay. Another dropped off some old tack gear. People who hadn't spoken to Frank since his wife's funeral were now waving, even stopping to ask how the horse was doing. It was like Sergeant had reopened a door Frank had long sealed shut. One afternoon, a teenage boy walked up and asked if he could pet the horse. "He looks like he listens," the boy said. Frank hesitated, then nodded. Watching the boy rest his head on Sergeant's neck, Frank felt something melt. A layer of cold he hadn't even realized was still there. A week later, Frank was invited to speak at the local school on Veterans Day. He almost said no, always, but something in him, maybe Sergeant's quiet courage, told him to say yes. He brought a photo of his son, and for the first time in 12 years, he told the story out loud. The students listened. Some cried. One girl raised her hand and asked if his son liked animals. Frank smiled for real, a small and unexpected crack in his armor. He loved horses, he said. Used to draw them all over his notebooks. That memory, once painful, now felt like a gift. Meanwhile, Sergeant was healing too. His coat began to shine, his gait grew stronger, and the haunted look in his eyes faded slowly. Frank would catch him staring at the hills during sunset, ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. But he always came back to Frank, always chose to stay. There were setbacks, of course. One night, Sergeant got spooked during a thunderstorm and kicked through the paddock gate. Frank searched for hours in the rain, terrified of losing him. When he found Sergeant in the cemetery, standing at the same grave, Frank dropped to his knees and wept. He didn't know if it was coincidence. He didn't care. Sergeant had come back to the place where it all started, and Frank understood then. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a reunion. 2 souls carrying loss, finding something sacred in each other, something whole. By spring, Frank's property looked different. The fence was rebuilt, the grass trimmed, and a proper stable now stood where a tool shed used to lean. Sergeant had his space, but he spent most of his time near the porch, always within sight of Frank. It wasn't just companionship anymore, it was a bond. Frank's routine changed. He started each morning with coffee and a walk around the yard with Sergeant trailing close behind. He talked more to the mailman, to kids passing on bikes, even to Linda's photo on the windowsill. The silence that once ruled his days had been broken, gently and fully. He didn't just feed a horse, he fed purpose into his own life again. On Sundays, he took Sergeant to the VA center, where other veterans sat in wheelchairs and watched the big chestnut horse with wide, childlike eyes. Some cried. Some smiled for the first time in weeks. One man, missing both legs, asked to touch the horse's mane. "He looks like he remembers things," the man said. Frank didn't explain. He just nodded, because he understood. Sergeant wasn't just healing himself and Frank. He was helping others carry what was too heavy alone. A local reporter did a story on them. The horse at Hillcrest Cemetery. It went viral online. Letters came in from across the country, from mothers of fallen soldiers, from old ranchers, from kids who lost their dads in service. Each one thanking Frank and Sargent for the hope they sparked. Frank read every letter out loud in the barn, his voice rough but steady. Sargent would twitch his ears, turn his head, as if listening to every word. "They see you, buddy," Frank would whisper. "They see us." And it was true. Something about them spoke louder than grief. One year after their first meeting, Frank returned to the grave with Sargent by his side. This time he brought 2 flags, one for his son, and one for all the others who didn't get to come home, including, in a way, Sargent. The wind was quiet, almost reverent. He stood there longer than usual, Sargent's head resting gently on his shoulder. There was no sound except the birds and the soft creak of leather. "I thought I'd come here forever to be alone," Frank said quietly. "But I wasn't. Not anymore." As they walked back down the hill, Frank looked over his shoulder one last time. The grave was still there. The pain would never leave completely. But now it had somewhere to go. Now it had meaning beyond the ache. Frank didn't just save a horse, and Sargent didn't just find shelter. Together, they built something sacred from sorrow, a place where grief could breathe, a reason to keep showing up. And as Frank always said now, with a small smile, "He didn't just follow me home. He followed me back to life."